Russian artillery on positions at Corabia, Romania. Osotolkishva, June 1877. The Russian-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 was triggered by uprisings against the Ottoman yoke in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 1875 to 1876, and the April Uprising in Bulgaria, 1876, which was drowned in blood by the Turks. By the end of 1877, after hard fighting on the Balkan front, Russian troops liberated Bulgaria, and in early 1878 were already on the outskirts of Constantinople. On the Caucasian front, Bayazet, Ardagan, and the fortress city of Kars were taken. The Ottoman Empire recognized itself defeated, and in the town of San Stefano on February 19th, March 3rd, New Style, 1878, signed a peace treaty with the Russian Empire. A school for Indians on the Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota. A small parking lot of teepees, tents, near the public school buildings in an open field, housing the Indians whose children were educated at the school. 1891. Testing the strength of the railroad bridge over the Irtysh River. For steam locomotives passed over the bridge. Engineers and builders stood at this time under the bridge. 1896. Renowned conservationist, animalist, and biologist Carl Akeley with a leopard he attacked and killed with his bare hands. 1896. Wandering musicians. Japan, 1900. On Senate Square, on the 200th anniversary of the founding of the city of St. Petersburg, May 16, 1903. Mexican Jesus Garcia worked on the railroad between the towns of Nacozari, Sonora, and Douglas in Arizona. On November 7, 1907, the train he was working on was supposed to deliver a huge load of dynamite to the small copper mining town of Nacosari. By mistake, the explosives were loaded into the first cars, where the sparks from the steam locomotive's chimney flew, but at first no one noticed it. And when one of the railroad workers shouted to Jesus, "Look, it's smoking," it was too late. The straw that covered the dynamite was on fire. If all the dynamite in the cars had exploded, there would probably be no trace of the city left. Jesus Garcia ordered all the railroad workers to get off the train, which they immediately did. And he jumped into the driver's cab and backed up. He wanted to get the dangerous cargo away from the city, and maybe he hoped that the wind on the way would put out the fire. But just the opposite happened. The wind only made the straw burn hotter. Jesus Garcia managed to get the train 6 kilometers away from Nacosari before the explosion happened. The blast was so powerful that windows blew out and even collapsed several mud houses in the town. 13 people died, including Jesus Garcia himself. Just imagine how much destruction there would have been if the explosion had occurred in the city itself. Streets and schools in many Mexican cities are named in honor of Jesus Garcia, and the city of Nacosari was renamed Nacosari de Garcia. A monument has been erected to him, and songs have been written in his honor. A Packard truck carrying a Packard limousine. New York, 1910. Leo Frank, a Jewish pencil factory manager in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, was accused of raping and murdering 14-year-old Mary Fagan in 1913. As a very young girl, she worked in this factory, attaching erasers to pencils. Despite the strong opposition of the Jewish lobby, the court decided to execute Frank, but on the day of execution, June 22, 1915, the governor of the state pardoned the murderer, and he was given a life sentence. In August of that year, an armed mob of Atlanta residents entered the city jail, took Leo Frank out of it, and drove him to the other end of the state, as far away as 125 miles from the prison. In a huge crowd, the murderer was subjected to a lynch trial, beaten with a whip, kicked, and then hanged. The procedure was recorded in great detail by the photographers present. Curiously, no one was held accountable for this extrajudicial massacre, although the participants were known to the authorities and did not try to escape. This example well characterizes the morality of the U.S. society, which claims to be a universal fighter for human rights, independence of the branches of government, and the rule of law. The testimony about Frank's guilt in court was based on the words of Jim Conley, an employee of the same factory, who stated that he saw Frank committing the massacre of the girl. His words were the only proof of the crime. But A few years later, it turned out that the killer was Jim Conley himself. On that fateful day, Mary's friend saw Conley kill her in the factory and take the body to the cellar. But he was afraid to talk about it because of Conley's threats to kill him too. A giant pyramid of captured German helmets from World War I. New York Central Station, 1918. The Soviet-Polish War was an armed conflict between Poland and Soviet Russia, Soviet Belarus, and Soviet Ukraine. The fighting took place on the territory of Russia, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine in 1919 to 1921. The troops of Simon Petlura's Ukrainian People's Republic, UNR, and the West Ukrainian People's Republic, ZUNR, also took part in the conflict. In the first phase of the war, they acted against Poland. Then the UNR units supported Polish troops. In the first days of January 1920, the 3rd Polish Army of General Edward Radziwiłł took Dvinsk in a surprise attack. On March 6th, Moser and Kalinkowice. All 4 attempts of the Red Army to repulse Moser failed. At the same time, the attempt to go on the offensive in Ukraine by the 12th and 14th Armies of the Red Army also failed. The Red Armies were forced to go on the defense. On April 28th, Polish troops occupied the line Chernobyl-Kazan-Vinnitsa Romanian border, and then within a day passed 90 kilometers and stopped at the gates of Kiev without meeting any resistance. On May 6th, a detachment of Polish scouts captured a streetcar and rode it to the center of Kiev. The appearance of a group of Poles accelerated the evacuation, and on the same day, the last Soviet employees and soldiers left the city. And on May 7th, cavalry units of the Polish army entered Kiev, and on May 8th, infantry entered the city. Together with the Polish army, the Seczewics of Colonel Bezruko, a former captain of the Imperial Army, who decided to make a career in the UNR and eventually reached the rank of General Kornzago, entered Kiev. However, the Seczewics were few in number, an incomplete division. On May 9th, a military parade of the Polish army was held on Kreschatyk, hosted by General Radziwiłł and attended by Petlura. According to contemporaries, Kiev did not pay the slightest attention to the Polish troops, as it was the 15th change of power within 3 years. However, the Polish troops failed to hold Kiev. May 14th in Belarus began a counteroffensive, significantly strengthened Western Front under the command of Mikhail Tukhachevsky. And on June 5th in Ukraine, the 1st Cavalry Army broke through the front and forced the Poles to retreat from the city without a fight. On June 12th, Red Army troops again entered Kiev. But if the Poles' stay in the city did not leave a significant trace in history, their departure was remembered by everyone. Leaving the city, the Polish military blew up the famous Chain Bridge, built under Nicholas I, and became one of the city's landmarks, which decorated pre-revolutionary postcards with views of Kiev. Under the Soviet regime, the bridge could not be restored or did not want to, and eventually finished the surviving remnants so that they did not interfere with navigation. After 5 years in Kiev was built a bridge named after Eugenia Bosch, but he also built the bridge. Eugenia Bosch Bridge was built in Kiev 5 years later, but it was destroyed in 1941 during the Soviet retreat. The photo shows Polish troops entering Kiev. 1920 год. A policeman stops a busy New York City street so a cat and kitten can safely cross the road. 1925. Peasants take in a homeless child for foster care. Arkady Shaykhet, 1927. Photo of Lev Trotsky visiting the ruins of Pompeii during his visit to Naples. Kingdom of Italy, October 1932. Flying People Attraction, Gorky Park, Moscow, USSR, 1937. On the morning of June 17, 1939, robber Eugene Weidman met his guillotine and the whistling of the crowd in the square outside Saint-Pierre prison in Versailles. It was the last public guillotine execution in France. American actress Phyllis Gordon on a walk with her cheetah. 1939. Platoon commander of a reconnaissance company, Chief Petty Officer N.F. Garanovsky. August 31, 1941. Marine, the Great Patriotic War. Vicious and demoralizing machines. California, 1942. The mutoscope was a device patented in 1894 that created the illusion of motion for the viewer by rapidly changing several hundred photographs or drawings arranged on the machine's drum. To view a short movie of about a minute in length, the viewer who paid for the session had to turn the crank himself, watching the image appear through the eyepiece. The Taking of Frauenburg, 1945. Author Arkady Shaykhet. German prisoners of war after demoning a field walk through it personally, guaranteeing the result. Denmark, 1945. The first photograph of the world's first plutonium, taken by Fritz Garreau in 1946. Rural Dr. Ernest Sariani after an unsuccessful cesarean section operation in which both mother and child died due to complications. The town of Kremling, Colorado, USA, 1948. Sariani was the only doctor in a 1,200 square mile region. Toyota motorcycle. The company produced motorcycles from 1949 to 1960. They were produced by a subsidiary company, Toyo Motors. Toyo Motors aimed to produce simple and inexpensive motorcycles that the post-war world needed. By 1952, production had grown to more than 10,000 bikes a year. But success was fleeting. Toyo Motors was haunted by endless complaints about the quality of its motorcycles. This was due to the company's unusual decision to outsource almost all of its production. Motorcycles were simply assembled from parts and assemblies that came into the company. With this approach, reliability was out of the question. Toyo's engineers and employees insisted on reconsidering the business idea, but Kawamata, the company's owner, was not interested. At the same time, it is said that the territory of the enterprise was littered with defective units and assemblies. All that was missing for the collapse was a more efficient competitor. And so in 1958, Honda presented its Super Cub, and people's patience with Toyo motorcycles broke. With the introduction of an inexpensive but reliable alternative, they simply stopped buying them. Karol Józef Wojtyła, future Pope John Paul II, 1957. In a children's store, France, 1959. Street typewriter operators, Istanbul. A peddler of store number 30 selling fresh bread to residents of House 97 on Krasnoarmeyskaya Street in Kiev, 1961. Hair contest in Munich, Germany, May 1, 1964. On April 26, 1966, at 5:23 a.m. local time, an underground storm hit the Uzbek capital. The tremor, with a force of more than 5 points on the Richter scale, hit the center of the city. The same day, General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Leonid Brezhnev, and the head of the Soviet government, Alexei Kosygin, flew to Tashkent with a large group of specialists from specialized ministries. The next morning, a large meeting was held, at which it was decided to throw all efforts into the restoration of the capital of the Uzbek SSR. History has never known such a scale of reconstruction as in Tashkent and does not know it to this day. Later, it will be calculated that more than 2 million square meters of housing, 236 administrative buildings, about 700 trade and public catering facilities, 26 municipal enterprises, 181 educational institutions, including schools for 8,000 places, 36 cultural and domestic institutions, 185 medical and 245 industrial buildings were destroyed. More than 78,000 families, or more than 300,000 people, were left homeless. About 150 people were hospitalized, but there were no fatalities. The whole big country rushed to help. Only from ordinary citizens, more than 10 million rubles were collected to help the victims. 4 construction trains from Moscow were the first to arrive in the Uzbek capital. Already in May, they deployed 16 military construction teams on the outskirts of the city and installed the first hundreds of prefabricated houses. And by the new year of 1967, all the victims were under a roof. No one was left on the street in the rain and snow. Tens of thousands of builders from all over the USSR came to Tashkent. The grandiose construction site also became a school for Uzbeks. Young people from Kishlaks mastered modern specialties, went to study at technical colleges and universities. After the consequences of the earthquake were eliminated, round-the-clock construction continued, gaining momentum until the late 1980s. Tashkent was decorated with the Palace of Friendship of Peoples, TV Tower, hotels Russia, Duslik, Moscow, and Uzbekistan, History Museum, Publishing House Shark, University, Circus. The most beautiful subway was launched. Suffice it to say that a group of architects was awarded the State Prize of the USSR for the planning and development of the center of Tashkent. Tashkent was the first and only city in the USSR where all barracks and communal apartments were liquidated, and most streets became one-way. Even today, there are no traffic jams in the city of 2 million people. The traffic flows are relieved by 2 ring highways at once, a small and a big one around the city. Soviet designers looked far ahead. It was after 1966 that the Uzbek capital turned into a major industrial and cultural center of Central Asia, and it was prestigious and convenient to live there. The city absorbed the culture of different nations, but at the same time retained its national flavor, which was emphasized in every possible way in new buildings. And until recently, many Tashkent buildings retained inscriptions: to Tashkent from the Belarusian people, Moscow region to Tashkent, Chelyabinsk to Tashkent, Alma-Ata to the people of Tashkent. And residents and guests of the Uzbek capital liked to visit stores and cafes Donetsk, Moscow, Belarus, Berezka, Ukraine, Kivlyanka. Alas, these inscriptions and names have quietly disappeared in recent years. Open swimsuit designed by Elizabeth Taylor, 1968. On February 2, 1970, several Convair F-106 Delta Dart supersonic fighter Convair F-106 Delta Dart jets took to the air in the U.S. state of Montana from Malmstrom Air Force Base for routine training, under the direction of Major Curtis. One of them, under the command of Captain Gary Faust, fell into a flat spin while performing aerobatics. In an attempt to regain control of the machine, the pilot even used a brake parachute, but all was in vain. In the end, at an altitude of 4,600 meters, Faust ejected. Moreover, one of the actions Faust took was to set the airplane's trim for takeoff, which is similar to what pilots use for landing. He also set the throttle to the idle position and commanded a slow and steady descent. Everything was done correctly, but nothing worked. And then a fairly hitherto typical situation unfolded in an unusual scenario. Reduction of the aircraft mass, change of its center of gravity, and a jolt from the catapult engines brought the fighter out of the corkscrew. Surprised by the situation, one of the pilots, Major Lowe, remarked over the comms, "Gary, you need to get back in the airplane." Faust, also stunned that his plane was flying without him, slowly parachuted down toward the snow-capped mountains. Apparently enjoying his newfound freedom, the F-106 continued on at about 175 knots, 324 kilometers per hour, and set a course for the town of Big Sandy. Fortunately for all involved, its final destination was a snow-covered alfalfa field. When the local sheriff and local gawkers arrived at the landing site, they found the unmanned fighter slowly crawling across the snow-covered field, propelled by a still-running jet engine. The air base technicians contacted by the sheriff recommended that he simply wait for the aircraft to run out of fuel, which it did an hour and 45 minutes after landing. When technicians arrived in Big Sandy, they found that the damage to the airplane was minimal. Captain Faust landed in the nearby mountains and was soon found alive and well. His plane became known as the Cornfield Bomber after the incident, although the Convair F-106 is not a bomber, being a typical fighter interceptor. After repairs, this machine returned to service, and in August 1986, having been retired, was included in the exhibition of the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force at Wright-Patterson Base in Dayton, Ohio. Miners and their workhorse in a mine face. France, 1970. American soldiers in Vietnam smoking weed through a shotgun. Escaping boredom and low morale, many began smoking marijuana, which grew in abundance throughout the Asian country. 1970. Alexei Kosygin, chairman of the USSR Council of Ministers, at a meeting with Indian chiefs in Canada. The process of disposing of personal belongings of Pripyat residents after the Chernobyl disaster. Revolutionary Romanians in the office of Nicolae Ceausescu after his overthrow. December 1989. 1992. A Somali mother lifts the body of her child, who died of starvation. In the early 1990s, Somali guerrillas began an armed struggle against dictator Mohammed Sidebar. In the course of long battles and fierce clashes, the tyrant was overthrown, but all this led to massive devastation and disaster. In addition, there was a terrible drought. Altogether, more than 300,000 Somalis lost their lives. Collective photo of one of the Moscow region organized crime groups. Mid-90s. Firemen after extinguishing an underground passage. A terrorist act committed in Moscow on August 8, 2000 in an underground passage under Pushkinskaya Square leading to the metro stations Pushkinskaya and Tverskaya. As a result of the terrorist attack, 13 people were killed, 118 people were injured of varying degrees of severity. It is known that the bomb was set in a diplomat, left at one of the market stalls in the passage. The customers and perpetrators of the terrorist attack have not been found yet. The criminal case was suspended in 2006.